O Estado de S.Paulo is a daily newspaper published in the Metropolitan region of São Paulo, Brazil, and distributed mainly nationally. It is owned by Grupo Estado, a holding company which publishes the Jornal da Tarde and owns the radios Radio Eldorado AM and FM and the Agência Estado, largest news agency in Brazil. It has the second largest circulation in the city of São Paulo, only behind Folha de S.Paulo, and the fifth largest overall in Brazil. It is nicknamed the Estado. The journal was founded relying on Republican ideals on January 4, 1875, and was firstly called De Província de São Paulo. The motto of the newspaper is Estado, o Jornal que Pensarão. O is a Portuguese augmentative suffix. The current publisher is O Estado de S.Paulo S.A. History. The term provincia was preserved until January 1890, 1 month after the fall of the monarchy and the regime changed to the Republican institution in Brazil. Although the newspaper supported the change, it showed that it was completely independent, refusing even to serve its interests to the ascendant Republican Party of São Paulo. When the then editor-in-chief Francisco Rangel Pestana left to work in a project of the Constitution in Metropolitan, the young editor Julio de Mesquita effectively took on the direction of Estado and initiated a series of innovations. One of the innovations was the engagement of the Agência Estado, back then the largest in the world. The Estado pioneered the newspaper selling system in 1875, when it was sold on the streets, instead of the subscription-only system adopted by all other newspapers in Brazil before. As first, this new way of selling motivated many jokes and mockery, but ultimately all rivals adopted the same system. Today, newspapers in Brazil are sold in small street newspapers, magazines, shops, and by single sellers located in main avenues of the biggest cities. Back in the 19th century, the Estado was sold by only one man, a French immigrant, who carried his newspapers in a bag while riding a horse, and announcing himself with a cornet. 19th century. In the end of the 19th century, the Estado was already the largest newspaper in São Paulo, overcoming the Correio Paulistano, property of the Mesquita family since 1902. The Estado supported the Allied cause in World War I, suffering reprisal from the German community in the city that removed all the announcements from the newspaper. Despite this, the Mesquitas maintained the position of their diary. During the war, the vespertine edition of the newspaper began to circulate around the country. It was known as Estadinho, directed by the then young Julio de Mesquita Filho. In 1924, the newspaper Estado was banned from circulating for the first time, after the defeat of the Tenentes rebellion that shook the entire city. Julio Mesquita, who tried to intermediate a dialogue between the rebels and the government, was imprisoned and taken to Rio de Janeiro, being freed shortly later. With the death of the old director of 1927, his son Julio de Mesquita Filho assumed the directory along with his brother Francisco, the latter taking care of the financial parts of the newspaper. In 1930, the Estado, connected to the Democratic Party, supported the candidature of Getulio Vargas for the Liberal Alliance. With the victory of Vargas, the newspaper saw the Brazilian Revolution of 1930 as a mark of the end of the oligarchy system. The so-called Grupo Estado assumed in 1932 the leadership of the constitutionalist revolution. With its defeat, many people from the directory were exiled, including Julio de Mesquita Filho and Francisco Mesquita. 1 year later, in the month of August, Getulio Vargas invited Armando de Salas Oliveira to be the governor in São Paulo. Armando Salas, that was son-in-law of Julio Mesquita, imposed as a condition to accept their job the amnesty of the rebels of 1932 and a convocation of a Constituent Assembly. Vargas agreed, and Julio de Mesquita Filho and Francisco Mesquita, as well as other exiled people, returned to Brazil. Years later, with the appearance of the Estado Novo, the newspaper maintained the opposition to the regime, and, in March 1940, it was invaded by DOPS that, with absurdity and mockery, said that guns were arrested. In the redaction, the newspaper was initially closed and afterwards was confiscated by the dictatorship, being administrated by DIP until 1945, when the Estado was given back by the Supreme Federal Court to its legitimate owners. The numbers published after the intervention are not considered in the history of the diary. Shortly after World War II, the Estado enjoyed great advances with the increase in editing and of its good reputation. In the 1950s, the major Quedinho Street headquarters were built, adjacent to the Hotel Jaragua. That was the phase when the section International of the newspaper, directed by the journalist Janino Carter and by Rai Mesquita, became known as the most complete in any national newspaper. For that time until the 1970s, O Estado showed almost exclusively international news on its first page. Republica Nova. During the Republica Nova, the Estado profiled itself to the National Democratic Union of Carlos Lacerda and opposed all the other governments, especially João Goulart. Indiana 1954. O Estado de S.Paulo led a national campaign against the elected Democratic President Getulio Vargas, forcing him into suicide. In 1962, the director Julio de Mesquita Filho even wrote a Retiro da Revolução, trying to unify the opposition of civilians to the army, the then-called Boasting Party, that from the beginning of the Republic used to intervene in Brazilian politics. In 1964, the Estado supported the military coup and the indirect election of Castelo Branco. Shortly after the Institutional Act 10 Degree 2, that dissolved the other political parties, the journal broke from the regime. Censorship. On November 13, 1968, the Estado editor was arrested because of Mesquita Filho's refusal to eliminate from the section Notas e Informações the editorial Institutos M. Frangos, where he denounced the end of any normal and simple democratic appearance. For then on, the newspaper began disputing censored editions of its news by the Brazilian Federal Police, unlike other national newspapers that accepted to be censored. With the death of Mesquita Filho, the Estado was directed by Julio de Mesquita Neto. Then, the newspaper gained worldwide visibility when it denounced the previous censorship of its publication of verses of the Portuguese classic The Lusíada, by Luís de Camões. In 1974, it received the Prêmio Penha de Ouro da Liberdade, bestowed by the International Federation of Editions and Newspapers. In the 1970s, the newspaper ran into debt because of the construction of its new headquarters by the Tietê River and went through a financial crisis, competing with a new standard of journalism represented by Folha de S.Paulo. 1980s. In 1986, the Estado hired the renowned journalist Augusto Nunes to be its chief editor. He updated the news bulletin of Estado and endeavored a series of reformed graphics that would result in the adoption, in 1991, of colored printing in daily editions. Before that, Estado was not issued on Monday and holidays. 1990s. In 1996, Julio de Mesquita Neto died and Rai Mesquita, his brother, became the new director. Previously, Rai directed Jornal da Tarde, owned by the Estado network. Grupo Estado. After an unsuccessful experience in the area of telecommunications, the Estado network passed by a restructuring in 2003 and most of the Mesquita family lost their directing roles. Massive layoffs also occurred. After balancing its budget, the Estado endeavored new graphic reformulation in October 2004. It also created new notebooks and received many prizes for excellence in graphic display. Other than the newspaper O Estado de S.Paulo, the Estado network publishes the Jornal da Tarde and has control over the OESP media company that runs advertisements. Owned by Grupo Estado are the radios Radio Eldorado AM and FM and the Estado Agency, largest news agency in Brazil. Notas e Informações. The oldest of all the sections, known as Notas e Informações, always seen on page 3, maintains the traditional posture of the newspaper to unify, in its editions, political conservatism and economic liberalism, being one of flagship columns of O Estado de S.Paulo. However, since the 1964 military coup d'etat, and mainly after 1968, the newspaper became increasingly politically liberal, by supporting the legalization of abortion in Brazil, by criticizing U.S. presidents such as George W. Bush and Francis Nicolas Sarkozy, and by supporting the center-left president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet.